We're going to start here in just a moment. We are continuing in our study of Christian evidences. Tonight we are starting lesson 11, which is the second half of the study of creation versus evolution. And here in just a couple of minutes we're going to be looking at some of the arguments that are used and some of the challenges that come with those arguments. And so we'll be looking at that here in just a moment. Before we begin, I'm going to ask Jared if you would to direct our minds in a word of prayer.
Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for all the spiritual blessings you've blessed us with. Thank you for the ability for us to come worship you tonight. Help us in our thoughts to be centered and focused on you, and help us to remember the purpose and the reason that we are here to serve you and learn more about you. Help us always strive to want to read your word more and more and know more and more about you, and put you above our interest, and to do what you want us to do as opposed to what we want to do. Help us always want to spread the gospel to others, and help us look for those opportunities when they present themselves, and for us to be prepared and ready when that does happen. We thank you for everything you give us. We know everything we have comes from you. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen. Now, as we've talked about before, this particular area of the study is a bit more challenging because it is not biblically based as far as where we're going to open up a bunch of Bible verses and look. What we're having to do is address some of the arguments that's oftentimes used to kind of support the theoretical notion there of evolution. And oftentimes you don't hear the whole story. And in many of the scientific discoveries and the archaeological finds and everything, there are a lot of things that are just assumed or taught to be assumed that when you really look at in greater detail, you find that it's not quite the way that it really is, or at least not enough evidence to support the theory that they have drawn. And so in this particular lesson, we're going to start with the concept of spontaneous generation. And in spontaneous generation, how many of us were taught in school that Louis Pasteur disproved the notion of spontaneous generation? Yeah, I mean, we've all pretty much taught that. I mean, the way that it normally worked is you had a pile of rotten stuff, and at some point flies began to fly around it. So they spontaneously generated from that form. And that was believed for a long time. But it was proven scientifically that doesn't happen. And that's what kind of the first section here talks about. It's the law of biogenesis. And that is, life must propagate life. That you're not going to get life from a non-living source. And the thing is, though, and we don't have it on the chart, and we'll talk about it here in just a second, but I'll go a little greater detail here. In order for evolution to be true, one of the possible or proposed notions is that life came from a non-living source, that there was a spontaneous generation of life from something that was non-living. Now, everything that we know about our existence says that it doesn't work that way. When you think about human reproduction, when you think about animals, you think about plants, everything comes from something that's already living. I mean, that's the way that the whole of the world, and as far as we know, the whole of the universe works. But they did an experiment back in the 50s, the Miller-Urey experiment. And you may have heard about this back in 1953. Supposedly it was a landmark experiment where they put a series of 3 different gases into a pressurized, kind of like their own little soup there. It had ammonia and phosphoric salts, and light and heat and electricity. And so they did this experiment, had water vapors in it, supposedly simulated what they think the Earth was billions of years ago. And no oxygen in the atmosphere, nothing like that. You know, early primordial stuff. And so they did the experiment, and lo and behold, they found some amino acids and a couple little things like that. And so from this experiment, they concluded, Well, if we could generate amino acid with electric spark and sparking this weird soupy type mixture, then yeah, evolution is possible. Somewhere in the past, when the earth was like that, then millions of lightning bolts later, so forth and so on. But the problem is, when you do some more research into it, and there's one website I found called Truth and Science that addressed this particular experiment. Yes, it worked. The only problem is it wasn't stable gases. They were stable in the current environment, but to be able to last thousands upon thousands of years, for this happened repeatedly and repeatedly until finally you got some sort of cells that were able to divide, the gases weren't stable enough. And if there was any oxygen in the atmosphere, which they claim there wouldn't have been at this point, that would have nullified the whole of the experiment. And so the reason why I say that, you'll hear some people say, no, we've done it. We have made living matter from non-living matter. Well, that was just a one-time experiment that really didn't even really come up with life, just protein, a compound, and some amino acids in there. But it's not the same thing as what we're talking about. And it's a huge guess. They don't even know if assuming that the evolutionary process was right, they don't even know that was the atmosphere of the earth way back then. It's just one guess based on one experiment. And when everything is said and done, guess what we're still left with? Biogenesis is still the law. You're not going to get life from non-living matter. Glenda.
My book here that I have, it says that on this study that is in a lot of the textbooks, but then many of the textbooks will then say scientists have created the building blocks of life.
Yeah.
So that's what we have to realize what our children are being taught in school. You know, they take these tests, these studies, and they twist them. They don't give the whole truth. Okay, you created amino acids, but whether that doesn't prove anything.
Yeah.
You know, and there's a lot of fallacies in that study. So, but they don't put that in there.
It was methane, ammonia, and hydrogen. And you're right, and we're talking, they had to know what to look for in order to find the trace amounts of what was created.
It says they created 85%
85% tar. Well, that'd be handy. If you're fixing your roof, I guess. But the point that Glenn is making is a very good point. They'll put this in our textbooks and say, it'd be like saying, I made an apple seed, which I really didn't. They're like saying that this person has, in this experiment, generated the actual seeds of life. And he didn't. Yeah, that's a good point. And that's what I'm saying. But most of the textbook, they treat it as if this is fact. And then we are taught that it is truth, and it is readily accepted by many. That's a good point about that. Kyle, and then Arthel. That's true. They had to assemble. Yeah. Yeah.
And that did happen. God did create something.
That's right.
In a sense, I guess, but really maybe not because God is life.
Yeah.
He's always been around, so yeah, I guess he created from the life that he had.
Created us from him.
But
Yeah.
it still goes back to God.
Yeah.
Everything started with God. You're going to try to maybe hope that you're going to forget about that when you're trying to create these things. But it's like, you get that one.
Yeah. And in this age of reasoning that we live in, more people are accepting that. Yeah. Arthel. That's a good point. It's not just that he made man, he made the very building blocks that he built man upon. Yeah, that's a good point. So that's kind of the first argument there, that evolution has to, at least depending on what theory you choose to pick regarding how life began, the whole concept of spontaneous generation, it's not scientifically feasible. Yes, Dan? He asked about the methane gas.
Does not methane gas come from the body of living material?
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe I don't know enough about science to ask that question, but it seems to me that experiment from a world of living things would be flawed in the fact that there are living things around it. But, they could put it in a complete vacuum or whatever. Where do they get the methane gas?
Right. And keep in mind that this is kind of a separate discussion from how everything began. But it's still, that's a very, you still got to ask the question. Let's assume for the sake of argument they're right. How did that all get there? And yeah. Let's go ahead and move on to fossil record. Now, keep in mind, I'm not an archaeologist at all, and so what I'm doing is relying upon the research of others, and this is the material that we are studying through. The individual went through and compiled this, and much of the material from which it came, you'll see in the back of the booklet there that we had printed out as well. But the fossil record is going to be interpreted based on where you already begin. If you already have a solid belief in the theory of evolution, then when you look at the fossil records and everything, you're going to kind of interpret it that way. If you believe in the Bible, that God created everything, then you're going to make some other observations about it. Now, if you set both of those things aside for just a second, you still come down with one interesting fact. We have a fossil record. The fossils are there. They exist. Okay. Even the fossils of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs lived. Some point, they lived. I mean, their fossils are there. So a lot of it depends on how from where we are coming from, we look at this. And one evolutionist says that evolution actually did occur, can only be scientifically established by the discovery of the fossilized remains of representative samples of those intermediate types which have been populated on the basis of the indirect evidence. What did he say? The evolution actually did occur, can only be scientifically established by the discovery of the fossilized remains of representative samples of those intermediate types which have been postulated on the basis of indirect evidence. In other words, we still got to find some fossils of those intermediate species. Many times talk about the missing link. How do we get from this one to this one? And we're going to have to find those in order to ever substantiate the validity of evolution. But I want you to notice something here with this. If you believe in evolution, then here's what here's what the evolutionary model predicts, and this is all in the material behind me. It predicts that the oldest rocks that bear evidence of life would contain the most primitive forms of life capable of fossilization. Okay? You find the oldest rock, and what should you find on that rock? The oldest form of life, essentially. Younger rocks can contain evidence of more complex forms of life. Okay? So if you got a rock that's 1,000,000 years old, let's say, then it should have evidence of more complex life on that rock. That's what you would expect to find. There would be a gradual change in life's form from simple to complex. You should be able to find evidence of that. Where we've gone from the small, simple life form to now we have a very complex, and you see the connection there in the fossil record. There would be a huge number of transitional forms. And this is what Darwin was really hoping that would one day be found. Transitional forms, that is, transitional from one species to a distinct different species. Boundaries between types should blur as we look back in their fossil history. In other words, it should get more difficult to tell cats from dogs and mammals from reptiles. That's a very good point. If you go back far enough, you should find an animal and say, no, wait, this is a dog or a cat. Well, I don't really know. It's kind of an in-between. You know, some things that you would expect to find. And the criteria we use to classify plants and animals today would be less and less useful as older and older fossils show the in-between characteristics of presumed common ancestors for different groups. In other words, surely at some point we're going to find a lot more fossils the deeper we go within the fossil layer. And the deeper we go, the more simple, because this is how everything supposedly began. If you're an evolutionist in this model, these are what you expect and hope to find. We'll talk about the creation model in just a second. Yes, Dan?
What they have to do is find a non-human to a human. Animals to animals to human.
Well, unless you go species to species. Yeah.
Like non-human to human would be what they need to find, that link between those.
Wasn't it the Piltdown man that was a fraud? They found one they claimed was the missing link years back in the 70s or something like that. Yeah. That's what they have to find. And Darwin figures they would. It was about 120 years ago. But he figured, at some point we would find that. But now let's talk about it from a biblical standpoint. Let's say you're a biblical archaeologist and you believe in the Bible and the Bible's account, Genesis account. Well, here's what you expect to find in this model. The fossil record would show a sudden and explosive appearance of very diverse and highly complex forms of life. So you're digging down, archaeologically speaking, you're going down different layers, all of a sudden there's life everywhere. That's what you expect to find. There would not be a gradual change in life's form from simple to complex. There would be a regular and systematic absence of traditional forms since there were no transitional forms. In other words, you're not going to find the half cat, half dog, or half animal, half man there. You don't expect to find that. The variations of the types created would be found with extinction evident among some. In other words, you're going to find some creatures that God created that went extinct through the course of time. You find the evidence of them. The same kind of criteria used to classify plants and animals today ought to work just as well as fossils. In other words, if you find a fossil that you date back, let's say they say it's 100,000 years old, and it looks like to be a plant, they're going to be able to identify the plant just as they would today. Okay, the commonality is going to remain the same, is the point, if you hold to the creation model. So let's talk about this explosion of life here for just a moment. When you actually study the fossil records, this is what you find. Okay? Evolutionists will classify various sedimentary layers with corresponding periods of evolutionary history. So for the sake of this study, we're going to reference the Precambrian layer and the Cambrian layer. And just keep in mind, have you ever dug down in the ground and you go to different layers and everything? Well, that's what they're talking about. Certain research, they'll say, okay, this is several million years ago, this is 100 million, blah, and so forth and so on. But we have to understand their terminology because it's very interesting what you find. Let's see what he has up there. The chart's run a little bit different than this. The Precambrian layer, you dig down to that, very little life, fossil life has been found at that layer. They found some marine blue-green algae near Australia, but that same blue-green algae still lives there. They found some invertebrates such as soft-shell jellyfish, fossils from those, and they still live there. And that's about all. Okay, that's about all. But then you come up to the next layer, the Cambrian layer. You then, when you look at the fossils, you see life everywhere. You see what is called an explosion of life. They have plenty of fossils of highly complex forms of life. Sponges, corals, jellyfish, worms, mollusks, crustaceans, and so forth. Every one of the invertebrate forms has been found, as well as some vertebrates. All right. So the point is, we haven't, in all their archaeological digging and working with fossils, they haven't found this slow progression. You know, there's 4 here, and then the next layer there's 8, and the next layer there's 16, the next layer is 32. There's not that type of progression. One layer, there's very little evidence whatsoever. The next layer, there's fossil records all over the place. And so what would have to be the answer for this explosion of life? Well, from an evolutionary standpoint, it doesn't make much sense, because evolution is supposed to take millions and millions of years. How is it from one layer to the next we have so little and then so many? This is what creation is, what we would expect to believe and find. John Klotz writes, it is hardly conceivable that all these forms should have originated in this period, and yet there's no evidence for the existence of many of them prior to this Cambrian period. Now keep in mind, I don't hold to the millions and millions of years, okay? But looking at their terminology and what they're finding and how they're describing it, where's the rest of it? All of a sudden, everything is here. And that's where the fact is. The fact is, you dig down, you find that there's a particular level there, and guess what you find? A whole lot of fossils. If you go down deeper to the next level, guess what you don't find? A whole lot of fossils. And so whether you want to, whether they want to date them long time or short time doesn't matter with me at this point. The fact is, there is this explosion of life. And so the fossil record actually yields facts in strong disagreement with what would be considered the evolutionary model. Any thoughts or any comments about that? You think about this for a moment. When you think about what the Bible records, what great event took place that would have deposited a large number of animal carcasses throughout the world at different levels of the world? The flood would have done that. I mean, there's no question about that. And they have found seashells in higher elevations and everything, suggesting, and keep in mind, we don't know what the earth looked like before the flood. What we know to be oceans, there may have been more oceans. There may have been areas. We drive across country in the United States going through, I think it's Arizona. If you ever get the feeling you're driving at the bottom of a sea, how flat it is, and then you see the artwork of the landscape. If we ever found out that Arizona used to be underwater, I'd fine with that. That's the way it was, before the flood. Be easy fits without any problems there. Before we go on to the next section here, the absence of transitional forms. Any questions or comments about this? Okay. Kathy. Mm-hmm.
What stands out to me the most is by their own arguments that cannot be evidence. We are not asked to believe anything without evidence. God gave us plenty of evidence.
Right.
But they're asking us to believe in without the evidence of their own theory.
Yeah. That's right.
That's the thing. It's not that I'm using my God or the Bible to prove my point. Your evidence just doesn't prove your point.
Right. And part of it is part of the scientific process. And believe me, there are plenty of Christians who are very intelligent scientists who have walked through this and see the flaws with the evolutionary model. But it is the concept that you go from a hypothesis, you present a hypothesis. If no one can disprove the hypothesis and the peer reviews accept it, then it becomes a working theory. And it remains a working theory until it's disproven. And it's a theory that everybody accepts. Well, that's different than fact. I mean, it's still not proven to be that's the way it is. It's just we're going to believe it till someone disproves it.
Isn't it incredible how it's perpetuated?
It is, yeah.
And how it's been successful. And now it's overtaken.
Right. And they do that, and there's several areas of things that we're taught in school that are fundamentally still theory. But they don't conflict with the Bible, so don't worry about it. But it's when they begin to conflict with what the Bible teaches, that's when we begin to have the problems. Jed. Yeah. That's possible. That's possible. Any other thoughts? I don't know if I would hold to that argument, but it's. You mean dinosaurs aren't real? They're just the bones were. But I understand your point. If God had enough power to create out of nothingness the physical universe as we know it, then He has control over time and everything. He could have created the world in such a compression of time that if we studied the evidence, we might want to think it was billions of years, but it could have all been in an instant the way that he made it. Made it full grown, all the plants were full grown, evidence scriptures, Adam and Eve were full grown. That's why they didn't have belly buttons, we assume. But the point is, this is God. And it's what troubles me. We get to theistic evolution. It's like we want to tie God's hands. Once he created the heavens and the earth, or the universe, he's now bound himself to those laws. And we showed with the story of Joshua, when the sun stood still. He's not bound by the laws. We see that in the resurrection of Christ. Jared and then Dan. Yeah. And they've always dealt with that, the wisdom of men. Yeah. Dan. Really?
You scratched his head.
Okay. Well, then let's go on. Let's talk about the absence of transitional forms. All right. In other words, as one quote, and this I'll read from the lesson, as one begins to examine other parts of the fossil record, searching diligently for those transitional forms, which Darwin said must be there in inconceivably great numbers, what we actually find does not fit with what the evolution model predicts. It turns out that the transitional forms are quite elusive, or in fact absent altogether. Consider these quotations from evolutionists, and he continues there with some comments about it. And we're not going to take the time to read all those because you've got them in the lesson there. But it comes back to this. I believe it to be true, and we're going to keep digging until we find it. Now, I'll tell you something. We do something kind of similar, just a little bit. We believe the Bible, and we're going to keep digging to see what archaeological evidence we can find to continue to support the Bible. So what's the difference between the two of them? Well, archaeological evidence continues to support the Bible. Apparently, they found where the city of Goshen actually was, that there really was a city of Goshen. And archaeologists have proven, time and time again, they have found evidence that supports the Bible. But where's the transitional form in the fossil record yet? It still hasn't been found. And we don't need these to prove the Bible to us. It's just a nice bonus when you find a reference to a king by the name of David who reigned over a nation by the king of Israel. That's just gravy on top when it comes to, we would be like saying, yes, of course you're going to find that because he really lived. But on this other hand, there's not yet been any fossil evidence found that would show a transitional form from species to another species altogether. Any thoughts about that? Kyle?
Just taking this a little bit of a side note.
Mm-hmm.
Which is ultimately, I think, the reason that we're studying these things. Other people teaching these things and teaching these things, things like that. So what I would, say that we should be careful about is to, when we know this is right, we know we see the truth. What we need to remember is when these false teachings,
Mm-hmm.
all these things are being taught by friends, colleagues, teachers, whatever, is to really isolate the teaching and know that's from the devil, but do not hate.
Right.
Don't ever have an attitude like you don't know, how dare you, we're not against them.
Right.
We're never against them. We're against the devil. And
Right.
they may be a little bit confused. They may not even learn the real truth for years to come. But we have to be really careful when we're doing something like this, just to not take it to that level. Because that's when the love goes away and you're just trying to lead into I don't know.
That's right. That's a very good point. So sometimes we are tempted to get very combative, and in the end, we should be able to have a reasonable discussion if they want to, but not become an enemy against the individual. Even Jesus, when you think about who Jesus spoke most harshly against, who did he speak most harshly against? Yeah, the Pharisees, the people who should have known better. Yeah, when they brought in the account where they brought the woman caught in adultery, why didn't he rail on her? She was caught in adultery. He just gave her a pass. Well, he really didn't, obviously. The problem, the true sin, the sin that he had to deal with, were those who brought her to him. And so we still stand opposed to false doctrine. Kyle's not saying otherwise. But the way we treat people, the way we talk to them, it needs to be out of love. And you may find someone that every time you try to talk about this, they get mad and get real steamed. At some point you have to say, you know what? I can't talk to them about it anymore. I got to wait a while, But I'll still love them and hopefully can affect them. Let's go to Arthel and then Travis. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It would. That's exactly right. Travis.
Yeah, just kind of follow up on that, kind of what Kyle was talking about, how we approach people. We have to keep in mind that this takes faith on someone's part to believe this. So it sounds odd, not the same type of faith, not the same evidence of faith, but they have evidence that has apparently led them to this conviction.
Yeah.
And God believes in God and believes in this. But it can still be a strong faith, and it can still injure someone the way we go about it.
Yeah.
Like we just said, if it's in God, so it does take a certain approach to, like I said, attack the information, the teaching, not person.
That's right. This is speaking the truth in love. Yeah. Kyle.
And sometimes you don't directly attack what they're talking about. They're like, yeah, I think every day was like 1,000 years and everything. You may just be chomping at the bit to say something like, oh, I just want to tell them, 'cause I know it's going to make sense and it's going to, and I'll do it a really nice way. I'll be, no matter how kind you say it, sometimes it's not the right time. You have to think about these people. Like, there may be something much deeper that you can help them with just by, showing the love towards them. So, if you really want to help people, you have to think of it like, I really want to save their soul. Is this the right move right now? It's like chess. It's like playing chess.
Mm-hmm.
Don't just try to go for the kill, if you will. You're going to say that, and try to, I'm going to tell them now. Are you really trying to save them? Or are you just trying, Are you just trying to prove it? You're just trying to show them you're right in a nice way. So even being nice about it is still not always the answer. It's always just loving. You have to sometimes require stepping back and waiting for another time to do something.
Well, right. And what you're talking about is getting someone to realize that you care about them. It's not just about trying to get another convert. You care about their soul. I think about Jesus, coming to him as an example. Did he ever eat with the sinners and publicans? He did, you know. If he was going to be a Jew by the strictest sense, he wouldn't have done that. He'd been standing outside the house yelling at them, you know, the whole time. But he spent, and it's not saying that he condoned what they did, but he spent time with them and began to slowly teach them, and you know, the right opportunity, the right moment. And not everybody followed him. Not everybody accepted what he said. You know, but when everything was said and done, people followed him because of the authority and everything. But people need to know we care about them. And I've known preachers who would take a much different view. Their thoughts is, you're only going to have one time with this person, so you need to tell them they're going to hell. I found that to work very well none. You know, and when I was younger, I remember having conversations with someone. Yeah, I'm only going 5 minutes. Where do you go to church? Well, I'm sorry to hear that. You know, well, what do you believe about that? Well, I'm sorry to hear that. We need to sit down and set you straight. Even in the New Testament, the apostles, when they taught someone who did not know, it took time. And time and love with that. But it's a whole other discussion, but it's a good point, though. It's a good point. Kyle, or Travis.
Well, this kind of brings us back to this, a comment on this transitional form about, you know, then when I was going through a vertebrate zoology class, and this is a while back, but I see this little case that there's still not any evidence of this, so it's all depicted in artistic form.
Yep.
We're talking about going from a crawling fish to an amphibian to a reptile to a bird to mammal. Those in between transition species, they have to be depicted artistically because, like you're saying, those haven't been found, or else they would be shown clearly. Oh, here is the alligator bird. Here's the flying frog that has those type of things are not.
But
They haven't exactly been found. So my point was, it's all based on pictures, artistic depictions, representations. This is how it would have to be in order for this to take place. Same way with everything else that has to be projected, backwards through time.
yeah, that's a good point. See, I'll tell you, as much as I love science fiction, I do. I like science fiction. I like the idea of what things could be like in 300 or 400 years and so forth. It's all neat, nice and fascinating. But the problem is with a lot of the stories, okay, and there's one very popular TV series probably about 15 years ago, based in the future, so a lot more enlightened. They know a lot more and everything. And there's these two crew members, they got some sort of disease, something went wrong with them, and their body started de-evolving. And so the next thing you know, they're down on a planet and they're swimming through the water with two paddles and everything. This weird form of, think about what's that one lizard on the island, Komodo dragon, yeah. Imagine something like that. And they had de-evolved. And so they finally figured out what was wrong with them and gave them the formula, the serum and everything. And next thing you know, they're back with very little memory of all that. The problem is, it's taught as if in 300 years we know that to be the case. And that's just the way the facts are. And I mentioned that because Travis brought that to mind when he was talking about the imagery and the artwork. They guessed at what these things looked like. The things that the theory exists. And our young people, I mean, think about y'all and what you've seen going to school and what's on TV and everything. It's as if this is the way it is. And what we're asking them to believe is that's not the way it is. This is what the Bible teaches, and we have to separate fact from fiction. Or in our case, faith from fiction, really. Any other thoughts about that? Okay, instead of transitioning to the next subject, let's plan to stop for tonight, and we'll pick up with number D. We're going to talk about classification criteria. Please read through this if you haven't done so, just so that we can move on through it. Genetics is a very interesting argument against evolution. Once we get through that lesson, we should be able to do this next Wednesday. We're going to be looking at lesson 12, the error of theistic evolution, and kind of ask ourselves, why can't we just find some middle ground to make everybody happy? And we'll talk about that in lesson number 12. Any other thoughts or comments? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
Are they real? Were they real? And everything he did show us where they were. One of those families, the mother said, I have children who are studying this in school right now. How do they take the test? If they answer what they know, they flunk.
Mm-hmm.
The guy looked her right in the eyes and said, tell your child to put, the book says this. The Bible says this. But give them, because they give them the right answer. But the child has also been able to stand up for what he believes
Yeah.
and let it be known.
Yeah. If you write down the name Don Patton, and look him up on YouTube, he preaches for the Hot Springs Church of Christ in Hot Springs, Arkansas. He is an archaeologist, and he has a whole series on this particular subject. And be interesting, is very, very interesting to listen to in regards to this. So, anyway, appreciate all the participation and comments.